Hey there, welcome to another installment of Strange Planets. And if you'd like to get a little deeper into this podcast, you might want to consider becoming a premium subscriber. It's real easy to do. Just click on the link in the episode notes, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm. You gain access to ad-free listening. We love our sponsors, but occasionally it's nice to listen to uninterrupted. And you also receive special bonus episodes. Right now I'm running a series for premium subscribers called The Forgotten Files of Project Blue Book. Again, that's strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm. And today on Strange Planet, we're asking a question that's no longer rhetorical. Can I say that? In the wake of assassination of Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk, America is waking up to a new and terrifying reality. Words are being treated like weapons, and now people are being executed for using them. The line between speech and violence has been deliberately erased, and the consequences are catastrophic. Dr. Chloe Carmichael, a clinical psychologist, Columbia graduate, and USA Today best-selling author, says this isn't just a cultural crisis, it's a psychological one. In her powerful new book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly, Dr. Chloe argues that suppressing speech doesn't protect us, it destroys us from within. Silencing ideas breeds fear, anxiety, and emotional fragility. Free expression, she says, is the cornerstone of mental health, resilience, and authentic human connection. Dr. Chloe, who's appeared on Dr. Phil, Ask Dr. Drew, and the Steamboat Institute Freedom Conference alongside Fox News anchor Bret Baier, joins me to dissect how cancel culture, censorship, and the weaponization of safety are warping the human psyche. She explains why words are not violence, why universities have become ground zero for groupthink, and how self-censorship has become a form of quiet psychological self-destruction. In a moment when people are literally being killed for their opinions, Can I Say That is not just a book, it's a lifeline. Dr. Chloe offers practical, scientifically grounded tools to speak freely, listen thoughtfully, and reclaim sanity in a society terrified of truth. Because if we lose the right to speak honestly, the next shot won't just shatter glass, it'll shatter what's left of civilization's minds. Dr. Chloe, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
Thank you, Richard. I'm well. It's really good to be with you.
Great to have you here. Your book argues that free speech is essential to mental health. That's a profound idea. Why does expressing ourselves openly matter, not just politically, but psychologically?
Well, Richard, it's interesting. And I was thinking about that question in terms of your audience, too, especially. I know that obviously on Strange Planet, you guys talk about a lot of stuff that sometimes people want to label as conspiracy theories or, that this sort of stuff. And that's sometimes exactly the kind of speech that people go after and that they try to shut down. And so the connection, there's many connections between free speech and mental health. But we have to stop first and just think about language. That's one of the ways that we exchange information and ideas, and we learn from one another, and we examine things, whether it be, conspiracy theories or exposing things that, maybe other people are trying to suppress. And so when we're not able to be grounded in reality and talk to each other openly, and have the kind of support that is required sometimes. It takes a team of people to exchange information and sleuth things out together. And when we stop people from doing that, we warp one of the most basic components of mental health, which is to be able to be grounded in reality, and to have genuine, authentic social support where we can be ourselves with each other and tell each other what we really think. I mean, it drives people nuts to have to, pretend that the earth is flat, so to speak, when it's not flat or, whatever, but you just can't say so.
What happens specifically to the human mind when we self-censor?
Yeah, so we go through this interesting cycle It starts with suppression. Suppression is where you're actively telling yourself, like, stop it, don't say that, and I just want to say as well, I'm not suggesting that we all should have no filter, right? There's a time and a place where we should tell ourselves, hey, maybe not the time to tell my mother-in-law that this lasagna tastes awful, or whatever. My mother-in-law is a great cook, but so it starts with suppression. And if about important topics, about what we really believe, right? So when we're stopping ourselves through that cycle first of suppression, if we do it often enough, it graduates to repression, which is where we start doing it automatically without even really thinking about it. We don't have to really even actively cover our mouth from speaking. We just kind of knee-jerk know that we shouldn't say that. And then if we do that long enough, then we graduate into what's called denial. And that is kind of spooky, which is where we actually don't even fully understand and have touch with what we actually really truly believe anymore. And it can take sometimes even a jarring event, or watching someone, frankly, a lot of people had it with Charlie Kirk, as you mentioned, watching someone go through an extreme situation for what they believe to kind of jar a person out of a zombie walk state. And they're like, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. I believe that too. And then it can go even further, though, when you have enough people in a group that are in this kind of denial state, they can get into what's called group think, which I think you also mentioned there in the intro. And that's where we have things like, the Bay of Pigs disaster, or, a bunch of very smart people somehow overlooking what in retrospect was obvious to engineers about the Challenger explosion. When you have a whole bunch of people that are working in a team, but they are dissociated from important parts of their brain and their awareness, we can get into that groupthink cycle.
How difficult is that to reverse? So, for example, I'm thinking about people who live under authoritarian regimes where there was no free speech. The Soviet Union, Communist China, of course, still living under authoritarian regime. Russia, less so than for all their problems, less or more freedom now under Putin, whatever people might think of him, than there was under the former Soviet Union. How long does that take to reverse that in the human mind in terms of expression, or can it be reversed?
Well, yeah, I think it absolutely can be reversed. I think how long it would take to be reversed is going to depend somewhat on each person, because we all have varying trait levels of agreeableness and assertiveness, as well as of suggestibility, right? So if you start repeating the same things, talking points and narratives to people over and over again, some people will just absorb that more easily than others. And then, as you alluded to, there can be government factors as well. So if people are under pain of losing their livelihood or even their life, or extreme social ostracization, how far they've pushed it to the back of their mental closet can sometimes affect how quickly they can come out of it.
And you write that words are not violence. I mean, that to me is not controversial to say that, but it is, unfortunately, a controversial statement in today's climate. How do you distinguish between emotional discomfort and genuine psychological harm, especially when people insist that certain ideas cause trauma?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to understand that emotional discomfort is actually part of being resilient, right? So I think I would question the premise that emotional discomfort is, necessarily putting a person at risk of emotional trauma. In fact, I think colluding with the idea that a person is unable to withstand emotional discomfort actually creates a sort of fragility that can create a paranoia and a phobia of, God forbid you hear the wrong thing. It's like somebody ran you over with their car, or God forbid you should say the wrong thing. I've also talked to many people who have kind of a self-loathing or, extreme anxiety just over their own existence because they are so afraid, that they're going to say something. But to your point again about like, can words cause emotional, psychological trauma? I think again, that's going to depend somewhat on the mental health of the person to begin with and the context of the words. So for example, if you have a husband telling a wife after a 30-year marriage, I never loved you and I'm done with you, that right there can cause some pretty extreme emotional trauma. And it's not really the words, but what they signify.
Right.
Whereas you could have that same woman walking past, a construction site, and she could hear some really weird and vile and twisted things about her. And she could just brush it off and say, you know what, whatever. That's just a bunch of weirdos. What do I care what they say? So I think it has more to do sometimes with the listener than with the actual speaker. And that's good news because we're supposed to have our own sense of agency. We're not at the mercy of what other people say. That is a twisted and disempowering way to live your life.
I mean, in many instances, it's almost impossible to have an argument, and whether we're talking about a husband and a wife or let's say a public policy discussion, it's impossible almost to have an argument without causing at least some emotional discomfort.
Sure. We're supposed to get out of our comfort zone, right? Like that's exactly what we're supposed to do. And it's actually also through talking that we process and emotionally regulate ourselves, right? So, for example, if you have, person A is in an abusive relationship with person B, and it's really important that person A keeps actually talking about what person B is doing to him or her. Because if you stop talking about what's going on and what you're experiencing and what you're feeling, even if it's painful, that's actually when you can lapse into denial. And when we go into that denial and we're not in touch with reality, then we're actually less equipped to deal with the situation on the ground, right? So even if things are uncomfortable, right? Like that's one of those phrases, right? Like, oh, it made me uncomfortable. Oh, it was problematic. Well, that's actually what we're supposed to get out of our comfort zone. Having a belief that in itself is, quote, toxic is, it's a very anxiety provoking way to live your life.
Right. The moment anything becomes even mildly uncomfortable, people are retreating to their safe zones or declaring that they feel triggered. What is let's kind of invert this. What's the psychological harm that is being driven here on today's generation by being sheltered from uncomfortable discussions or conversations and being coddled?
Yeah, so safe spaces are actually ones that can handle conflict, right? The idea of saying, I'm in this safe space where nobody can say anything that I don't like because otherwise I would crumble. I would actually imagine that that's more akin to like an ICU unit at a hospital, right? Like an intensive care unit for people that are on the, brink of death or something like that. So yeah, I think it's a negative reinforcing belief if you get into the idea that you are unable or unwilling to hear anything that is going to, quote, hurt your feelings, as if that is just going to be the end of you. And then what it does also, of course, is it disconnects you from the ability to debate ideas, right? To even know how to either fight back for yourself and for your position, or even to change your mind. Because that's one of the other really important functions of language to humans, is that it allows us to take our interior life, which is kind of this amorphous, swirling, experience where we're just, perceiving and being and feeling. And then we have to literally translate it into this organized system of language and words that other people, can understand. And through doing that, we do what's called externalize. We take what's in our head and we turn it into kind of objects. That's what thoughts and language phrases are in psychology, sometimes thought of as objects. And so when we can take that interior life and make it into an object, we can become objective about it and evaluate it and realize we don't have to be merged with our thoughts. And so if I change my position or my feeling or my opinion about something, which I've done many times, it doesn't mean that my existence is challenged, which again, I think is so interesting because that's where some of the people, and I don't know how careful I have to be about what I even say on your show. It's
you don't have to let
ironic
it fly.
things. Yeah. But I mean, like, say you can have trans people, and it's one of their, kind of go-to phrases in that activist community of trans people anyway, is to say, that you're, quote, threatening my existence if you say that you disagree that I'm a man or I'm a woman, right? I'm a woman, and if somebody tells me that they don't believe I'm a woman, it doesn't threaten my existence in any way, right? And so it's actually psychotic. In psychology, we call something psychotic if it is representing a break in reality, right? So it's like, the little green men, the person who's a schizophrenic, they're seeing and existing within things that are not in the realm of reality. And I believe it's psychotic then, this idea that words are violence, or that if you're saying the wrong thing, it's, quote, threatening my existence. It's like, no, it's not. And what's really shocking to me is that my own profession is like leading the charge on this. So, I almost felt like as a psychologist, I had to write this book as a public service announcement to give sane and common sense people ways to answer back if somebody tried to silence them in the name of, quote, hate speech and bullying or misinformation or whatever else, because ironically, it's the mental health so-called experts that are ironically leading the charge to silence people, which is super weird because psychologists are always historically have been the people who say, just talk it out, just, use your words, we can say what we want. And I'm like, where are you people now?
Excellent point. I think it was Marshall McLuhan. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was McLuhan, the great communications guru, who said that violence is a quest for identity. And so it would then follow that if you, and that words, I would say, words are an expression of one's identity. So that it's almost the inversion of what is being argued. Rather than words are equal to violence, the suppression of words, I would say, could lead to violence. Would you agree with that?
Totally. So again, as a psychologist, if you're working in a prison population with violent offenders, right, one of the first things that we want to do is teach them how to use dialogue. We want to boost their emotional vocabulary and teach them how to express themselves at lower levels of frustration, because we know that if people hold things inside, that's when they fester and eventually, erupt like a powder keg. So again, that's why it's so baffling to me. And there is something interesting too, which is studies have shown that the group of people that tends to either distance in real life over political differences. And I do think the political fact is important here because that's where we're talking generally about our values, right? Like what really matters to us. Politics just simply means public life, right? So when we're talking about people's perceptions and values about the public square and the public life, and the same group of people that tends to distance in real life or drop contact altogether in real life, defriend on Facebook, disinvite a speaker, or decline to date. In the book, I call it the 5 Ds because they all start with D. The same group of people that will, by their own self-report, do all those things over political differences is the same group of people that YouGov polls here now show are 2 to 8 times more likely to endorse violence as a strategy to achieve their political goals. And as a psychologist, I think there's a very clear connection here. And I think it's important, again, to try to educate and reach people. I don't think there's anything in anybody's DNA that, makes them want to shut down speech. I actually, again, really believe that the people who want to shut down speech, for the most part, are very coming with good intentions. We all know what the road to hell is paved with, right? But nevertheless, I truly believe that they have good intentions, and that if I could help them to understand that this stomping out of speech is not going to make the world a kinder place, it's actually the opposite. It's a recipe for violence. My hope is that they would reconsider the strategy, because I think we all have the same goal, which is to have a more harmonious society.
Right. I mean, it's certainly a recipe for radicalization. If you suppress people and prevent them from expressing themselves, then I think McLuhan, if it was him who said that, was absolutely right. Violence is a quest for identity. I want to talk about universities. We touched on a little bit earlier, but I mean, they're supposed to be places for open inquiry and debate, obviously, and yet they've become, in many cases, the most controlled speech environments in the country, United States and Canada. One of my sons attends the University of Ottawa, and one day, I think it was the first day of class this new year, one of his new professors stood up and announced to the class, and I'm quoting now, "I'm a raging Marxist." He certainly has the right to say that. I guess the question is, why did he feel the need to say that? What's the psychological purpose behind that declaration? What is a student supposed to do with that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, for one thing, it's a trend, right? Like at universities, it's almost like saying, I'm strongly affiliated with the intellectual elites, right? Because for whatever reason, that system of thought seems to be gaining traction. And I think, as well, it's an interesting way of phrasing it. Like, I'm a raging Marxist, kind of like saying, come get me, right? Like, oh, I've heard the criticism before that I'm a raging Marxist, and I'll just go ahead and own the label. So kind of a way of saying, this is who I am, and I'm in your face and aggressive about it. And it is interesting, too, as you said, why would he feel the need to announce it? Did you say, Richard, what class it was? Was it relevant to the material?
That's a great question. Let me think now. I'm trying to think if it was a philosophy class. I think it may have been a philosophy class. So yeah. I suppose it was in context, in the proper context, the proper setting, right? Marxism is a philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, in a charitable way, which unfortunately the statistics don't suggest is likely, because statistics show that students feel increasingly afraid to voice their opinions because they feel that their grades and things like that will be hurt on campuses. So it's unlikely. But in a charitable, interpretation, I would like to think that, hey, maybe he's announcing it as a way to say, this is my perspective, but I do everything I can to be respectful of other people's perspectives. I'm just, out of a sense of awareness and mindfulness, trying to acknowledge, like, this is where I come from. However, again, from what we know about the way that universities, as you said, are scoring abysmally when it comes to ratings of students, perceptions of feeling like they can have a diversity of viewpoints, it's probably more likely that he was saying it in kind of an aggressive way, like, yeah. Hey, and any of you capitalists, I'm just putting you on notice that you're in Marxist territory, and, don't spout off with any of your nonsense because I'll get you. You know what I mean? It's kind of the way I might be worried about what he meant. I don't know.
I think you're 100% right. And as you say, a more charitable way. What a wonderful, I don't agree with anything that Marxists have to say. I think, in fact, that it's an abhorrent and evil ideology, not the person, but the ideas. But what a wonderful way to open up a discussion. It's almost, it's exactly what Charlie Kirk was doing on college campuses. I'm a Marxist. Prove me wrong. Or, convince me I shouldn't be a Marxist. That's I think, a valuable way to open up a discussion. However, I think you're right. I think it was basically a veiled threat. Speaking of Charlie Kirk, and in the wake of his public execution, many people are asking whether the culture of moral outrage, this belief that words are violence, is actually normalizing real violence.
Yeah, I think it is normalizing real violence. I mean, I can remember, I'm not sure exactly how many years ago it was now, but I think it was around, 10 years ago that people started, the phrase punch a Nazi started to come up in parlance. And the idea there was, it's okay to use violence against, Nazis and fascists and all these, really, quote, bad people, right? And I was living in New York City at that time. And even prior to that, Occupy Wall Street was even a little bit prior to that. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was walking from the subway to my apartment, 7th Avenue and 13th Street, so kind of the West Village area of Manhattan. And the Occupy Wall Street people were marching down, I think 13th Street. Anyway. And one of them jumped out of the crowd and pushed me, and I mean, I was wearing, like, I'll admit, like, I was dressed like a bourgeoisie, right? I had like a little Hermes scarf on, or, carrying a nice bag or whatever. And, it was my first real brush with that. But you're right. I think the idea of mixing speech and violence, is normalizing violence, combined with this rhetoric and framework that suggests that violence is justified, against the, quote, oppressive class. I mean, we even have cases now, as I'm sure you know, where people, for the first time that I'm ever aware of, and all of a sudden it's happening in a bit of a spree, is that we have cases of people writing words on bullets, right? Mm-hmm. That are used to shoot people, such as Charlie Kirk, but also others. And so it's as a psychologist, we would call that, really merging, and this incredible fusion of the idea that, these words are violence, quite literally, almost, in these cases. So yeah, I mean, and it's so ironic, of course. I mean, one of the most violent groups is Antifa, and they call themselves Antifa as if it's anti-fascist, when, of course, that is the fascism, is to show up and, shout down speakers, or, do violence against people that have ideas that are different from yours. And as you said, it's prevalent on campuses. And it's so sad, because I think that most young people go to campus with a deliberately open and malleable mind. And so, they can have these ideas put in their heads, even sometimes by, as you said, the professors themselves. And I think something really, I'm glad people are at least finally seeing the problem squarely.
We often think of censorship as something governments do, but increasingly it's social, enforced by peers, HR departments, or online mobs. What makes people so eager to silence others?
Well, so that's interesting. So as you said, it is somewhat just something that is happening as a social trend without necessarily the influence of government. However, I believe that the way that social trend got established in the first place to the level of intensity that it is currently at is because there was government involvement that created a false sense of social consensus, which is one of the 8 ingredients in Irving Yannis's groupthink. Irving Yannis is the psychologist who coined the term groupthink. And one of the ingredients that he talked about in that was the illusion of unanimity. And now we know, it is not disputed, executives at Meta, which of course is Facebook and Instagram, as well as then Twitter, and now just very recently YouTube, have acknowledged that there was indeed government pressure that was causing them to silence, dethrottle, and deplatform people who, for example, said a man cannot become a woman. Meanwhile, they were absolutely platforming and amplifying posts saying that, protect trans kids at all costs, with like a picture of a bloody knife, as we had a representative here in the United States that she was wearing a T-shirt when Governor Tim Walz signed, some legislation to, quote, protect trans kids. And so what that did is it created a social narrative that was false. It a person could go on social media and think that everybody believes that way and that this is the new norm. And then therefore anybody who did say anything differently was really treated and seen and viewed as some kind of an extreme social pariah and ostracized. So I think you're right on one level. This is happening on a social, just kind of voluntary level without government laws being in place. But that social dynamic did not appear without government assistance.
That's an excellent point. I'm opposed to cancel culture, although I have to say, and again, coming back to Charlie Kirk, when we saw on social media, professional people, even politicians, excusing the murder of a father, a husband, a Christian, or celebrating it. And again, these may have been healthcare professionals, a nurse, a doctor, a university professor. I found myself, maybe rethinking that, thinking, okay, you know what? That person should be canceled. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do think, again, that it is perfectly fine for us to have social norms, and private businesses are not obligated, to employ people regardless of the way that they behave in public, right? So it's perfectly fine. People can get fired from their jobs for, cheating on their wife, right? For having a public affair that hits the newspapers, a firm can say, oh, gee, we don't want to be associated with that, right? So I think it's important to understand that firms and businesses, private employers are not obligated to employ people. But I do think it's important to understand that there's a big difference between being socially ostracized because you endorsed, advocated, or celebrated not only violence, but actual political violence, which is a whole other level of terrorism and intimidation and danger, compared to social ostracization because you have a different opinion about immigration, or you have an opinion about COVID vaccines, or whatever the case may be. One should be a red line in society, which is outright advocating, for violence. Again, it's ironic that the same people who would say, well, suggesting that a man can't become a woman, that's so violent that we have to cancel such a person. But then when it comes to somebody who's literally, indisputably actually advocating for political violence, that they don't seem to understand it's genuinely a separate category. Just one more quick point on this is that as a clinical psychologist, if a patient comes to me and tells me that he is thinking of doing bodily harm to somebody, it is my legal obligation to break confidentiality and do whatever I can to stop that from happening. If a patient comes to me and tells me, I'm going to say the meanest, nastiest thing to my neighbor, and it will maybe even mentally scar her for life, I am absolutely forbidden from, breaking that confidentiality. So there is a clear, just objective, and again, we're getting into that psychotic question about, do we not understand what is actually violence? So I think you're absolutely right, Richard, to notice and treat it differently, that you have different feelings about, socially ostracizing people who celebrate and advocate for violence, especially political violence, compared to people who have a different political opinion than you about nonviolent topics.
Your book, you talk about tools for productive disagreement. I mean, that's easier said than done in today's climate. Can you walk us through one or two techniques you teach clients for staying calm, curious, and grounded in a heated conversation?
Yeah. So part one of the book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. Part one is unpacking the cognitive and emotional and social benefits of language, just from a psychology science standpoint. And then part two, as you said, is all about tools. And within part two, there's tools for speaking up when it's hard, and there's tools for listening well, because that's also a very important part of dialogue. So since you mentioned tools for listening well, I can start with those. And I think a good one for that is actually when someone's saying a point of view that you find ridiculous, which we've all been there, right? Because, it's just happened to everybody. It can be helpful sometimes to mentally imagine and remember a time when you yourself have held in the past a political or, viewpoint of any other type that you now regard as completely ridiculous and even a little bit cringy, like if it were to come up, right? And, you can kind of recognize like we've all kind of been there, so to speak. And that can help us to be a little bit more charitable when we're listening to somebody else. Now, on the flip side, I'm still thinking about your son at Ottawa, right? And I do discuss situations like that too, tools for situations like that. And it can be extremely helpful if, say, your son was thinking of speaking up or, heaven forbid, writing a paper that disagreed with Marxism. What he might want to do is to find an ally. So when we're, just speaking up all by ourselves, it can be really hard and more scary, as well as the person we're standing up to. If they perceive that you're the only one, they'll bulldoze you a lot more than if they start to realize, whoa, maybe this isn't just one little victim that I can victimize so easily. It can also be really helpful to arm yourself with information. So to take the, even if you just pop it into ChatGPT, put the, university policy manual into ChatGPT and say, I'm thinking of expressing a viewpoint that's going to disagree with my professor. I'm worried about retaliation. What in this manual would, give me protection and that kind of thing. And, one more final thought, again, is just the whole safety in numbers and not allowing someone, like abusers love to get their victim alone and isolated, right? So Project Veritas, in case people are not familiar with that, they're actually now making available cameras and training to citizen journalists and different things that are legal in different places. So I think that they'll provide people with some guidance on that too. But, it can always help as well to just, keep a record of exactly what's happening, even with video.
Some critics, those are great tips, by the way. Some critics will argue that unrestricted speech allows misinformation to spread. And we hear that all the time from a particular quarter. Misinformation, disinformation. How should we respond? Those of us who are absolute free speech advocates, how do we respond to that concern? Where do we draw a responsible line without strangling open discourse?
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book called Common Objections to Free Speech. And one of them is, what about misinformation, right? And so in that part of the book, I highlight a few key areas where, for example, Galileo saying that the Earth orbits the sun was, considered, quote, misinformation, and he was jailed for that, right? Or my own profession, used to say that lobotomies were a great solution, or, in the past we had, bloodletting, right? All kinds of things that the, quote, experts told us we just simply had to buy and believe, and anything else was, ridiculous misinformation. And so it's just really important that we have to be able to have speech and debate. No matter how silly some people might think that, some of our debate is. Just a quick example, this is actually part of what got me interested in the mental health benefits of free speech, is during COVID, I was in New York City, where I lived and loved being there for about 20 years. And I had a 3-year-old that the law, they were saying he'd have to be masked everywhere he went, and going on, forever. And so I said, well, I can't do this. We went to Florida, and I wrote a blog just to even organize my own thoughts about all the reasons why masking children for, hours and hours and days and weeks and months and years and then couldn't be good for them. And I shared it with some colleagues to say, like, hey, am I just like missing something obvious here? I'm kind of afraid to publish this because nobody else is talking about it. Am I going to embarrass myself? Something obvious here. And they said, no, Chloe, everything in this blog is correct from a scientific standpoint, but we do not think you should publish it because it could discourage people from masking their children, right? Like, so
you're right, but yeah.
Yeah. So I published it, and it led to, got picked up by Dave Bhattacharya, all kinds of other great people. And being in Florida, I started having more open dialogue, and I realized how important it was to my own cognitive and emotional and social processes. But, that's just one example, again, of where, quote, misinformation has been now have more things that we were told were misinformation about COVID have now been shown to be actually true, right? So yeah. I would just say, who owns the truth?
Who is the arbiter? Yeah, virtually everything that the supposed crazy people were saying about COVID turned out to be. I mean, it says right there on the box, the masks will not prevent the spread of viruses. And you could show that to somebody. I don't know. What do we call that? Cognitive dissonance?
Yeah. It's cognitive dissonance is a whole other interesting thing where we change our behavior. Where we change our thoughts to accommodate our behavior. So if for whatever reason I happen to have to go to a certain taco place every day, even if I don't want to, I'll eventually start telling myself that I love tacos, right? So it's just an interesting way that our minds can be manipulated in all kinds of ways. I share in the book too about just even some classic experiments where people showed lines. Line A is clearly shorter than line B, but they can get people to say the opposite just by having a whole bunch of people in the room that say the other thing, right? And so then, one person kind of just starts going along with the crowd. And again, they know it at first, but then the longer they do it and the more frequently they do it, they start getting confused truly themselves. I mean, it's almost spooky what our minds can do, which again is just why I think it's really important that nobody should be suppressing or interfering or tampering with our ability, to use speech. Steven Pinker, the incredible psychologist who studied language, said that humans need to talk the way that spiders need to spin webs. It's just that intrinsic to our being. And so we really cannot interrupt it for any reason except for the obvious, which is, somebody who's going to give an explicit direction of like, go do such and such bodily harm to that man right now, right? Like that's illegal. It's stuff that's already illegal. But as far as the exchange of information and ideas, it should never be interfered with.
That study you just cited, I'm familiar with that somewhat, and it's surprising. Maybe not surprising, but what does that tell us about humans? Like, if you have a room full of 10 people and maybe some of them are plants, and they say, no, line A is shorter than line B, when obviously the reverse is true, and then the others step in line and agree. What does it say about us that we have an innate need to conform or to get to become part of the group?
It's called normative social pressure is the actual name for it. But yeah, there is a value to, we have safety in numbers. There's, through evolution, maybe like a sense of wanting to belong to the tribe, or even just to conserve cognitive energy. If you see everybody else is going right at the stop sign, you're just like, well, that must be the way to the concert because there's a big line of cars and the concert starts in 10 minutes. Everybody's going that way. Mental shortcut, right? So there's a desire to be normed along with the group. It's almost like etiquette as well. It's a way that we have of showing and communicating that we notice the group and that we care about the group and that we want to fit in with the group. There's a certain level of agreeableness and accommodation that, makes the world run nicely, right? But we do have to be careful of it because if it starts getting applied to pressure about, values or information that we actually have a sense inside is not right, the thing to do is to talk about it because, hey, maybe we're wrong. Maybe through talking about it, we'll even come to see why the group is right. But just simply not talking about it at all, I believe increases anxiety as well as potentially even, vulnerability to depression, because one of the hallmark symptoms of depression is a sense of helplessness. And it's through our words that we start to organize and figure out appropriate actions to take, right? Sometimes it's through talking about things that we work our way and springboard our way up to action. And so if we interrupt our ability to talk, we can also interrupt our ability to take healthy action and to advocate for ourselves. So again, it's so ironic because I think the same people that try to suppress speech in the name of hate speech and bullying and misinformation, they always like to think of themselves as like these big mental health champions. And so I really believe if I can, maybe I'm naive, but I really believe if I can get to them and say, hey, wait a minute, it's actually not good for mental health to suppress speech. Maybe they might open up their minds.
Right. You were sort of pointing a finger at your own profession, so you've given me license to do the same. And when it comes to, I've noticed in this space, which I've been operating in for about 30 years, and I talk about conspiracies, not necessarily conspiracy as a theory, but also conspiracy as a legal term. Mm-hmm. But I've noticed that over the 30 years, whenever someone is arguing that something was a conspiracy, there will be books written about to counter that. And sometimes, many times, they'll quote psychologists, or the book is written by a psychologist. And the book is about, rather than debating, based on the argument and whether this fact is true, why did Building 7 fall down or so forth, on the merits of the argument, they attempt to step inside the mind of the person who has that theory and figure out what's wrong with that person. That's how these arguments now are being debated. They're not being debated. It's, again, I guess it's sort of an ad hominem attack. But let's examine what is socially wrong or psychologically wrong with these people who are so contrarian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, attacking the person rather than the idea, right? Which is oftentimes, I think, a giveaway that the interlocutor does not have a good response to the actual idea. And so because they cannot engage with the idea successfully, they turn to attacking the person.
Right. A conspiracy theorist comes up with a theory because they feel powerless, or some such thing. Anyway, if we accept the idea that speech is vital for psychological health, which you argue, what can ordinary people do right now to build the confidence and the resilience to speak up in their own lives, whether at work, school, online? You gave us some tips earlier, but maybe we can explore that some more.
Yeah, well, I think the first point is just simply to really understand that free speech is important to mental health, that expressing yourself authentically is important. Because I'll say even myself, again, I didn't fully realize that myself. I kind of went along to get along a lot more than I probably should have in my life. And I did it in part because I didn't see the harm in it. So just like we needed to tell people, hey, cigarettes cause cancer, first helping people to understand that there is a cost to staying silent. It's not just like, oh, the easy way out, that there's a real cost to it, not only, for yourself, but also to others around you. If I've learned how to check myself to say, am I making people feel like if they don't agree with me that I'm not going to be their friend? And so now I've also gone out of my way to let people know that I want to hear what they have to say, even if they disagree with me. But I would say that in addition to some of the ideas I shared already, and I swear that there's like a ton of them as well in the book, but if people just feel for whatever reason sometimes that they really cannot share their ideas, if they're like, look, Chloe, you don't understand, my HR department will crucify me, and there's nowhere else I can work, and they're just like end of the line there for a certain situation. I would say it's important to make sure that you are still talking to other people or writing down what you really think, because that sounds like kind of an abusive situation, right? When people use these blackmail tactics, like if you don't say that you agree with us about immigration or whatever, then, you're going to be totally blacklisted. And so there might be times where you just have to make the strategic choice to not speak up. But just like with an abuser that wants to silence their victim, the victim has to keep talking about it to somebody. Otherwise, the victim can internalize and normalize and go into that denial state. So no matter what, if you just cannot find a way, if, finding an ally doesn't help, or arming yourself with information, or, even writing down all of your talking points in advance to make sure that you can really speak up to somebody, make sure that you talk in some way, even if it's just on paper. Another thing, though, that can be helpful is to realize that we cannot prejudge people for ostracizing or rejecting us when we haven't even given them a chance. So there's been situations in my own life even, again, where I told you I went through this little shift of realizing I needed to speak up. And there were people that I'd been kind of smiling and nodding with for years. And then when I realized I wanted to speak up, it wouldn't have worked if I had just one day exploded on them and said, yeah, well, I think such and such, or whatever. I had to take ownership. And so that can be a nice launch pad into it with people, to be able to say, you know what, I have been keeping a lot of views to myself because I haven't known if or how to express them. And I've been afraid that people are just going to, reject me or vilify me or misunderstand me. And so I have to admit, I've even done that with you. I want to share with you what I really think about, abortion, or what I really think about, religion, or such and such political figure that, you're always trashing that person, and it's not your fault because you didn't even know how I felt, but I want to tell you what I really think. And then a nice way to go into that with someone is there's a technique in couples therapy called reflective listening, where you share or they share, and then the other person just repeats it back and says, okay, I want to make sure I really heard you. You feel X, Y, and Z. And you just repeat that until the first speaker is truly heard and understood. And then you switch roles and the other person says what they think, and you kind of go back and forth. And it sounds simplistic, but it's important because couples therapy research has shown that when our heart rate goes above 100 beats per minute, we are literally not processing clearly what the other person is saying. So many of these arguments and differences can escalate without people even actually understanding each other. So reflective listening is a good one too.
Great point. Great point. I think we're at a stage now where conversations are about winning rather than achieving clarity of each other's position. Okay, that's what you think. Now I'm clear on how you feel. This is how I feel, rather than trying to dominate that person.
Totally. Dennis Prager actually says that. He says that the goal in these types of situations should be much, much less about agreement and much more about getting a pinpoint exact level of clarity about exactly where we disagree. So for example, do we have a factual disagreement about how much crime is committed by certain population, for example? Mm-hmm. Or do we agree on the facts about it, but we have a difference of opinion about what's driving that crime rate? Really just kind of thinking about it more like with your investigator sleuth hat on together, as if you're just really trying to pinpoint and achieve clarity about where you branch apart, can take some of the power struggle, win the argument feeling to just tell the other person, like, my goal here of a successful conversation is not to quote win or to have you win. I just really want to see if we can have a richer understanding of how the other person feels. And for some people, if they're in a good faith, dynamic, then that will put you off in the right track. If they're not, if all they want to do is quote own you or argue with you, it's good to understand that, because there's, we can't control what other people do. And if that's all that they want to do, then, we can just excuse ourselves from the conversation because there's no point in that.
Mm. As a clinical psychologist, do you see a parallel between what's happening culturally, this mass silencing, this fear of saying the wrong thing, and the kind of conditioning or learned helplessness that's often seen in trauma or abuse victims?
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. So yeah, the learned helplessness, just so, if your listening audience may or may not understand, but the classic example, it's a kind of a very sad example in psychology textbooks, is a dog, that's just repeatedly shocked, no matter what he does. And at a certain point, he'll just kind of like lie down in a very submissive, give up, sort of position. And I think that's a great point, Richard, that if we are in this thing where it feels like the speech police are going to get you, because you say things that were just considered completely normal, common sense things, or because the color of your skin, you can't speak about that as a cis straight white man, or, whatever. If your immutable characteristics are, fair game to, turn you into some kind of a conversational piñata, then yeah, I think there can be, I think that's a good point. There can be a sense of learned helplessness, but what we have to do is to realize that those shocks aren't real, that just because that person wants to take barbs at us, we don't have to respond to that. Again, their words are not violence either. And so, we can learn how to rise above that and say, you know what, a few years ago, you calling me a racist might have intimidated me or shut me down, but I know it's not true, and I'm happy to continue talking and even explore that label with you, but I'm not going to internalize that.
One more question. If free speech is the immune system of a healthy society, do you think what we're seeing now, the censorship, the self-censorship, the weaponization of language, is it part of a broader attempt to break down that immune system? And if so, how do we rebuild it before it's too late? I mean, some suggest, and I think rightly so, we could be on the precipice of civil war.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, some of the platforms that have contributed to the demonization and vilification of certain groups, ironically, are owned, say, like by foreign entities, right? Or within universities, they can get incredible amounts of funding from foreign entities. And so I think you're absolutely right to wonder, is there even an engineering amongst, driving this divisive ideology that could degrade our society almost by design? I think that's a great point. And what do we do about it? Well, we get my book and we listen to shows like this and conversations like this. And again, we just learn that little impulse to lie down like the dog that's overshocked and to be in the learned helplessness position, to realize we not only don't have to do that, but that it's actually harming our society as well as ourselves if we do that. Again, many of us, including myself, for a long time, really didn't see the harm in just keeping our mouths shut while people said a bunch of nonsense. But now I'm starting to realize, and I think other people too are, that we don't want to be part of the problem, part of that false sense of social consensus. Somebody has to say the emperor has no clothes, right? That's actually a strong and healthy and empowering thing to do.
Can I say that? Why free speech matters and how to use it fearlessly. Dr. Chloe, how do we get a copy?
Thanks so much for asking. People can go to freespeechtoday.com. And if you go to freespeechtoday.com, it'll tell you, all the various, it's wherever books are sold, but all of the links are there at freespeechtoday.com. And so are my Twitter handles and all that other stuff if people want to connect that way too.
Thank you so much for this. Great meeting you, Dr. Chloe.
You too, Richard. Thank you so much.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.